Okay, so it's been a couple of weeks since we've had any of the discussions, and since we've done any recordings. It's mostly my fault. I've had to take a class, and I had a test to prep for and some assignments, so I've been kind of busy. So now I'm gonna try to get back on schedule and start um, putting together some responses, and then continue the conversation with Adam. All right. So before the last thing that we put up is a video that Adam did where he kind of gave his take on some of the issues regarding LGT. And I'm going to respond to that video in my next episode. So for this one, I want to make one last effort to focus attention on what I consider to be the most critical element in this conversation. Before I get into topics that I feel are kind of secondary, which are some of the things that Adam was bringing up. Okay, so the question now that I want to address is, why am I even doing this? Why get into this conversation? Why discuss this topic? Um, you know, somebody watching this might wonder, what exactly are we talking about? It doesn't seem very clear where we're going. Maybe the positions are too similar, like Adam and I seem to agree too much when in fact there should be a lot more differences. Maybe somebody's thinking that, the approach that I'm taking here is not the approach that most LGBT experts, people that have been publishing books on this topic, maybe they would have done things differently if it was up to them. And what I would say to all this is to ask the question, has this strategy worked? So let me put things a little bit differently than we think about, usually think about regarding this topic. So sometime, and things can go back even further, but let's say in the 1960s, Questions on Doctrine was published, and Andreessen wrote his letters to the churches like I've described in one of the previous videos. Froome and the General Conference and a few other people kind of opposed Andreessen, and all this stuff happened. But the result of this debate, this controversy, this conflict between these two parties in the 1960s has been to cause a break in the church. So as a result of this, we've had sort of like the right-leaning and the left-leaning Adventists since that time. Now, my question is, what I'm trying to bring up in this particular video is that since the 1960s, there's been a lot said on the topic of Last Generation Theology. A lot of books have been published on both sides. People have been writing against it. People have been writing in support of it. It's been 60 years at least since this debate has been going on. And my question is, has this worked? In other words, if in the 1960s there was a split in the church as a result of the issues relating to Last Generation Theology, have all the efforts made so far been successful in bringing back these two sides? This in healing this sort of division that has been the result of this all these issues coming up. And I would say no, we're not anywhere closer now than we were 60 years ago in coming back together as a church. And in fact, this division has been sort of like a bouncing board for many other even more divisive issues coming up within Adventism. So what I'm trying to say here is that maybe we need to rethink how we're approaching this question. Maybe we need to try something different. And what I want to do is propose a different strategy. I want to put it out to people for their consideration that maybe if we're going to keep doing the same kind of thing we've been doing all these years, we're going to get the same results, which is basically a church that is split over this topic. So the problem is both sides of the argument, they somehow sort of made peace with the reality of things the way they are, to the point where they don't seem to really care or even think it's possible to bring about healing. So people on the left, let's just say, people from the seminary, people who have some theological training, who oppose Last Generation Theology, they've more or less have settled the issue in their own minds, and they've done everything that they think can be done on the topic, and they're going on with their lives and moving on to other things. But the problem is our churches are affected by this stuff. Like I said in previous episodes, anywhere you go in the United States and throughout the rest of the world, well, a good segment of our membership is affected by the issues revolving last generation theology. So we can ignore them, we can move on and think about other things, maybe even more serious uh, issues that are going on in the church. But the fact is, these problems remain and they continue to divide our church. People on the right side of the issue, people on the that are pro LGBT, um, they also are probably have come to a place where they essentially just dismiss the other side and they say, well, these people, they're apostate, they've left the Adventist message and all this stuff, and they don't care anymore. But the church is in this condition; it's split, and nobody seems to be coming up with a solution. So I want to try to propose a solution here, and hopefully others might take this into consideration, because there is a possibility that approaching things this way might actually bring about some sort of healing. All right, so what am I talking about? Uh, just to kind of introduce the process, some of you are familiar with the way triage is done whenever you have emergency situations, when we're talking about medicine. So whether you're working in the emergency room or whether you're a first responder, you show up on the scene where there's a massive accident with many different people injured. You come up to the scene and you have to decide who you're going to help first, because you're one individual, a lot of people need help, and you cannot help them all at once. So there's this sort of step-by-step process. And first, you deal with the people that are in critical condition. They have an obstructed airway, they're not getting enough oxygen, their blood pressure is not right, all these different things. So that's stage one. If you take care of all these people, then you can move to stage two with people that are in less critical condition but still at high risk, and then you move down the ladder. So there's this sort of triage process in how people deal with emergencies, how they deal with medical situation. And I'll propose that we should apply a theological triage here when it comes to last generation theology. So what do I mean by that? Okay, so in previous videos, I presented this pyramid. When it comes to last generation theology, there's sort of different layers at which the conversation takes place. There's the basic issues of justification versus sanctification. There's the idea that perfection is a possibility. Then there's the close of probation requirement for perfection, and several steps up all the way to what I call the vindication motive, which is part of the LGT system. Now, I would propose that the bottom two layers don't really have anything to do with Adventism. They're not in the sense that they're not part of the Adventist message, but they're not something that is strictly Adventist. In other words, issues about justification, sanctification have been around forever. The idea that perfection is a possibility has been around in different groups, like the Methodists, for example. I've mentioned this before. So these issues go beyond the scope of the LGBT discussion. So I would say, let's just remove that for now, in order to simplify the situation, simplify the discussion. Okay, and then I'll propose that we take these other three levels of the pyramid and we label them as LGT1, LGT2, and LGT3. For those that don't remember what I talked about in one of my previous videos, LGT3 is the idea that God expects people to reach perfection, character perfection, after the close of probation, but this is something that He's going to accomplish. So it's not a requirement that's up to us in the sense that, unless we make it to perfection, unless we get there, we're lost. No, whenever it's time for probation to close, God is going to make it happen so that everybody that's alive at the time is going to be perfect. Now, I'm not saying this idea is correct or right or wrong or anything like that. I'm just describing one version of last generation theology. So basically, perfection is required after the close of probation, but it's something that God accomplishes, not us. So that's the LGT level 3. LGT level 2 is to say, no, it is something that we have to do. Okay, so we need to be perfect after the close of probation for whatever reason. But LGT1 says, well, the reason we need to be perfect after the close of probation is because we need to vindicate God in the great controversy. So not everybody that believes in LGT2 also believes in LGT1. So that's why I'm separating this as three different layers here. So what I am proposing as a different strategy for approaching this issue of last generation theology is to concentrate on LGT1, to isolate this version of LGT as the one that's the most problematic and in fact is actually heretical, as I label here, and then to label the other versions of LGT as benign errors. They're problematic, they have issues. There's a number of problems with them, which I'm actually going to discuss in my next video. But the problems are of such a nature that we can put up with them, we can live with them, and find a way to move on as a church in spite of them. While the first version of LGT is actually fully heretical, and we need to address it head on. Okay, so again, what I'm talking about here is one strategy, a different kind of strategy than the way the issue of last generation theology has been approached before. And the suggestion is, let's differentiate between different types of last generation theology and concentrate on the one that's the most problematic, which is the version that calls for this idea of vindicating God. And I'm going to explain what I mean by this once again, and then probably move on from this topic, because I think I've kind of tried to address it from different angles several times already. All right, so what I am proposing is that if we focus on the vindication version of LGT version 1, the one that is based on this vindication motif, and if we concentrate our attention on clearly demonstrating that this idea is faulty and that it's incorrect biblically and that it's problematic on many different levels, that there's a chance we could start to bring back the different sides of Adventism and to reunite them, at least on agreeing together that there's a problem with this version of LGT. So that's kind of the focus, or the proposition I'm making here. If we focus on this version of LGT, the most problematic one, we might be able to generate some kind of consensus across the board on the fact that there's something wrong with this idea. So now I want to kind of go into it a little bit and explain what exactly is problematic with the idea of vindication. I've done this before to some degree, but I want to go into a little bit more detail. Now, before I get into this, I need to spend a little bit of time talking about the idea of redemption. So what exactly do we mean when we say, when we speak of God redeeming humanity, God redeeming the universe, all these different things? What does redemption mean? Now, if you were to ask this of the Christian world in general, they will say, well, redemption is God saving humanity from death, saving humanity from hell, saving humanity from sin, some version of that. So for most Christian, redemption revolves around Jesus dying on the cross to save humanity from being lost in some way, however they think of it. That's what you get from most people. Adventists, however, have broadened that category a little bit by saying, well, it's not just, redemption is not just about saving humanity, it's about securing the future of the universe as well. Why? Because all created beings have free will, and because they have free will, they could always rebel a second time. They have that capacity to do so. So the plan of redemption is not just to save humanity from sin, but it's also to make sure that all intelligent beings have all the pieces needed, all the pieces of data, all the evidence needed, so that they know never to do this again. And in this way, the universe is secured from sin for the rest of eternity. So Adventism has kind of broadened this idea of redemption to go beyond just saving humanity to saving all created beings from the possibility of sin rising up again. Now, Last Generation Theology has tacked onto this idea, but taken it to something of an extreme, to the point where the emphasis on securing the universe is almost bigger than everything else. So the idea is, um, the central question, according to Last Generation Theology, is can the law of God be kept? And in order to prove that the law of God is kept, you know, the plan of salvation was not just Jesus dying on the cross, but it was also the life of Jesus, where he lived this perfect, sinless life for 30 some years. And we don't necessarily agree with that, but disagree with that. But Last Generation Theology has put more of the spotlight on this aspect of redemption and then on the death of Christ aspect of redemption. Um, because of this, because the keeping of the law side of Christ's ministry is emphasized, then they can extend that and say, well, there's we also need the lives of this 144,000 at the end of time to demonstrate that it's not just Jesus, but even human beings that can keep the law. And by doing this, by demonstrating that God's law can be kept, somehow they secure the universe against the possibility of sin for the rest of eternity. All right. So while redemption for maybe evangelicals, for example, might mean simply salvation from death and sin, for Adventists, it means also the securing of the universe against sin. But for Last Generation Theology, it's an emphasis on this aspect of securing all created beings against sin for eternity. All right. Now, I would say the idea that the great controversy revolves around the question of whether God's law can be kept is itself problematic, because if you think about it, the great controversy started in heaven, and it would not make sense for Satan to go around questioning and placing or insinuating doubt in the minds of the angels as to whether the law of God can be kept, because they had been keeping it for their entire existence. So up to the time Satan started asking questions, everybody had already been keeping God's law perfectly. So it doesn't make sense that this was the central question in the great controversy. So already there's a problem here with the way Last Generation Theology proponents reason about the great controversy. So what then was the issue in the great controversy? Well, Satan's argument wasn't so much as to whether God's law could be kept, because they were already doing it, they had been doing it for their whole lives. The question was, should it be kept? In other words, Satan questioned whether God's law was the kind of law a loving creator would put up or impose on his creation, or whether it was a selfish law that was just there for God's sake. So the issue was, should the law be kept, not can the law be kept? And there's a significant difference there. So there's a problem in Last Generation Theology reasoning from the very start of their reasoning process. The central point for them is, can the law be kept? And because that's the question, they have to demonstrate that God's law can be kept. And Jesus did part of that demonstration, but that wasn't enough, because obviously he was the Son of God. So somebody else has to also demonstrate it. And that is what the great controversy, according to them, revolves around. All right. So keep that in mind as we move forward with this. Okay, so let's take a look at what had to happen in order for God to accomplish what he was trying to do in the great controversy, according to Last Generation Theology proponents. All right, so let's first look at Jesus. Now, when you look at the life of Jesus, was it theoretically possible for Jesus to fall into sin? We have to say yes, theoretically it was possible for Jesus to sin, because otherwise it would not demonstrate anything. If he was incapable of sinning, if somehow he was prevented, then all Satan's attempts were pointless, because there was no way for Jesus to ever fall into sin. The very fact that the Bible says he was tempted, if we assign meaning to words, it means that the possibility exists for Jesus to fall into sin. Now, what would have been the consequences of Jesus's failure? Like, let's just say, because the possibility of failure existed, Let's just say Jesus came on earth, and at some point during his 30 years here, temptation got too big for him and he just gave in. What would have been the consequences? Well, we don't know exactly, but it would have probably been drastic. In other words, uh, salvation would not have been possible anymore. Um, and we don't know what else could have been the consequence of that. Maybe Jesus himself would have been lost. Maybe, other people that we believe were taken to heaven before, like Moses and Elijah and others. Enoch would have had to return back to earth and die like everybody else. So there would have been serious consequences if Jesus had failed. So again, the possibility that Jesus could have failed existed, and the consequences of such a failure would have been serious and drastic. Okay, now, does this mean that God placed the universe at risk here? Well, no, God didn't risk the fate of the universe because of God's foreknowledge. So God knew ahead of time, and here's a balancing out, because we have to really think about what foreknowledge means. Foreknowledge doesn't mean predestination, where God forces certain events to take place, but foreknowledge means just that God knows ahead of time what will take place. So because of God's foreknowledge, he knew that Jesus would be victorious. So in that sense, he didn't place the universe at risk because he knew what the outcome would actually be. Okay, but just because God knew the future doesn't mean the battle was any less real. So when Jesus was on earth and he was facing temptation, that was a real battle. He actually had to struggle. He actually had to he came to a point of praying that God would take the cup away from him. It was a real battle that he faced in the moment, even though from eternity God had foreseen the fact that he would eventually be victorious. All right. So how did Jesus conquer temptation? How did Jesus overcome? Was it because he had extra power to resist temptation by the fact that he was the Son of God or anything like that? Well, no, he actually overcame in God's strength. So he surrendered to God and to the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit gave him the power to resist Satan and to overcome temptation. So Jesus didn't overcome in his own strength, even as a divine human being. He overcame through the power of the Spirit as well. All right. So because of all this, because Jesus's victory was foreknown, and because he overcame in his own strength, did that mean that his victory wasn't significant? And the answer is no. We all recognize the fact that what Jesus did for us was a major victory. So the fact that God is the one that gave him the strength doesn't lessen what Jesus has accomplished. It doesn't make it any less a victory, correct? So this is what we see when we look at the story from Jesus' side, all right? Now let's look at the story according to Last Generation Theology from the side of the 144,000. All right, so now let's go through this whole list again. Will failure be possible for the 144,000? Well, if failure is not possible for them, then they're not going to be vindicating anything, because then it would just be, like it would be predestined, or it would be manipulated, controlled. It would be something that doesn't prove anything. So it cannot be a vindication if failure is not possible for them. So in that sense, they would also have to be just like Jesus. They would have to have the potential for failure. And what would be the consequences of the 144,000 failing? Well, that's a question for Last Generation Theology proponents. If the 144,000 do fail, given the possibility exists, just like the possibility existed for Jesus, what would happen if they fail? Well, if the consequences for Jesus' failure would have been drastic, and if the 144,000's victory is important as well, then the consequences for their failure would probably be drastic as well, right? Assuming that we buy into the storyline that we get from Last Generation Theology proponents, right? Now, does this mean that God will be putting the universe at risk by depending on the 144,000? Well, no, because again, God has a foreknowledge to know that this group will be victorious. So just like Jesus, God would, if this idea is correct, then God would know whether or not they're going to be victorious, and he would not put the universe at risk unless he knows for sure that they would be victorious, right? Okay, but just because God foreknew or foreknows that they're going to be victorious doesn't mean that their battle is any less authentic, any less real. Well, no, just like with Jesus, his battle was real, even though God foreknew that he'll be victorious. Are they going to be gaining the victory in their own strength? No, they're going to be gaining the victory in Christ's strength. They're going to be gaining the victory through the Holy Spirit, just like Jesus did. Jesus also gained his victory through the Holy Spirit. Is their victory going to be significant then? Well, Jesus' victory was significant, and he was pretty much in the exact same situation. So that means their victory is going to be significant as well. What they accomplish at the end of time, assuming this scenario is correct, is going to be just as significant as what Jesus accomplished, because they're doing the exact same thing, which means that they are a component of the redemption process. So if we look at the big picture, where redemption is not just Jesus dying for us to redeem us from sin, but redemption includes the entire process by which God ensures the security of the universe for eternity, then what Jesus does here and what the 144,000 do on the other side of history comes together to make this thing possible. So in that sense, they're contributing to the redemption process, which is why it is a form of co-redemption. Okay, so when I tell people the vindication motive is a form of co-redemption, they have a series of objections, and these are just some of them. But I'm going through some of these just to show how this idea has serious problems, and that we could actually do a lot better at pointing these problems out to people. So here's the first objection I usually get. Well, we can't take credit for the victory because our victory is secured, right? So the 104,000, when they accomplish their mission, God has already declared that they're going to be victorious, so it's nothing for them to be taking pride in. But their victory cannot be any more secure than Jesus's was, right? So just as Jesus' victory was secured in the sense that God foreknew that Jesus would be victorious, their victory would have to be secured in the same way. So they're not doing anything different than what Jesus was doing. Objection number two. No, this is not called redemption because the 144,000 will not gain this victory in their own strength, but in God's strength. Well, Jesus didn't gain the victory in his strength. He got his victory in God's strength as well. And yet, he still gets credit for what he accomplished on earth. Okay, here's a kind of a different type of objection. This one says, no, this is not a form of co-redemption. God is only doing this because he has already promised that in his word that it would happen, and God is just accomplishing his own promises here. It's not anything that the people themselves are doing. Well, to look at that type of objection, we need to go back in time and say, okay, let's go back before God made those promises. In fact, let's go back all the way to the beginning of history and say, okay, before God even created anybody, before Lucifer was created, before the rest of the angels and humanity was created, at the very beginning of time when God was considering about what it would take to create intelligent beings, the question at that time, as God was thinking through this, did God look at it and say, okay, I need some way to secure the universe to make sure that if sin rises up, it will never rise up a second time? And when God looked at the future and thought about what he would need to do, did he say, well, I need two things. I need my son to die, and I need this 144,000, my son to die, my son to gain a complete victory over sin, and this another 144,000 to gain that victory as well. If God looked at the entire future and said, look, the only way I'm going to be able to do this is if I have these two things take place, then that by definition is a form of co-redemption. But if that's not the case, if God didn't see the need to have this group of 144,000 also gaining that victory at the end of time, then it doesn't really help or explain anything anymore. So whatever it is that Last Generation Theology proponents are trying to explain or to justify by introducing this group at the end of time, well, it would be unnecessary, because if at the beginning God didn't see the need for it, there will be no need for him to make those promises later down the line. So no matter how we look at this, looking at this idea from every single angle, it just breaks down. It doesn't make sense why this thing would need to be there, and how it could be there without it being some form of co-redemption, which the Bible clearly condemns. So what I'm trying to show here is that this idea breaks down. It falls apart no matter how we twist it, no matter how we try to adapt it or adjust it, or try to uh, explain some of these difficulties away. When you try to fix one problem with the concept of vindication, it creates 10 other problems that we have to then address. Okay, so one of the reasons why the concept of vindication has such a um, has persisted for so long is because of this question that last generation theology proponents keep asking. And the question is, well, if everything was accomplished at the cross, why did history continue on? Why are we still here today? Why couldn't, Jesus die, get resurrected, go up to heaven, and maybe 10 years later, or 5 years later, or 100 years later even, come down and take the disciples with him, and be done with history? Why have we had 2,000 years of more of history? And because this question often doesn't get a convincing answer, other alternative suggestion, or other, like, if because nobody has proposed uh, another way to respond to this question, then last generation theology proponents come up with their stuff, and they say, well, the reason is because God needs this final generation that can reach character perfection and defeat Satan. And that's what God has been waiting for. That's the reason why we're still here, and it's taken so long for Jesus to come back. But this is not the only explanation. This is not the only logical or sound reason why Jesus might delay so long to return. And in fact, this is actually not a good reason. I'll show this in a second. All right. So uh, one of the question that comes up just naturally when you think about what Jesus coming down here and living his life, and then giving his life for us, having being resurrected, and then the apostles, he goes up to heaven, but the apostles finally get what happened, and then the apostle Paul is converted, and now they have this picture of God that they've never had before. So they're going into all the world to share this message with the world. But in doing this, there's actually a question that rises. And the question is, what will be the result of humanity being made aware of the gospel? Because think of it this way, right? Like when you compare humanity to the angels and to other created beings, Satan sinned in heaven. He sinned with the full knowledge of God. He sinned with the full understanding of God's love. The angels had experienced his love for who knows how long before um, they had to make a choice. And those that sided with Satan in spite of a full revelation of God's love that they had before they sinned. But humanity never had that luxury. After Adam and Eve, every other generation was born in a world of sin, and they had a thwarted picture of God, and they had a lot of misunderstandings about who God was, and his nature and everything else. So humanity went through 4,000 years of history in the state of darkness when it comes to who God is, and they sort of made the best they could with the limited light they had. And there were still people that were faithful to God in spite of this limitation. But now there's a question. The question is, humanity has had a chance to see for themselves the love of God, because Jesus came here. God became incarnate. He came and lived with us. He gave his life to save us. So now humanity has a chance to understand the love of God and to see a side of God they've never seen before. And there's a natural question to this, which is, what are human beings going to do with this information? What are they going to do once they realize who God really is, and the fact that he loves them, and the fact that he is willing to sacrifice himself for them? And in order to answer this question, you need to let history go on for a while. And you need to see the effects of the gospel on humanity. to see what humanity after the incarnation will be like, in contrast with what it was like before the incarnation. And what do we see as a result of history continuing on? Because a lot of times, uh, history is not the kind of thing that happens immediately. You have to let time unfold. You have to let history unfold to really see the effects. Sometimes it takes generations for something to really develop into its full potential. And so, what did we see as a result of the gospel message being brought to the awareness of the human race? Well, the result of that over several centuries was actually terrible, in the sense that human beings figured out that they could turn the gospel into a tool of oppression. So what we see is that at some point, as the church grows and as the church metamorphosizes over time as a result of all this different political and different types of forces, what we see is that people start to take advantage of the gospel as a way to control people. And we see the church rising up to the place where they gain a very strict control over massive chunks of humanity by using the gospel in some way, by using the religion, the Christian religion, where uh, people, entire empires, entire nations come under the control of the church, and the church can manipulate them because people are sort of brainwashed or indoctrinated to think that the church controls their eternal fate, and because of that, they have to subject themselves and submit to the power of the church. So over time, what the watching universe had a chance to see is how the gospel was transformed and manipulated and turned into a tool of oppression for humanity. And this is something that needed to be demonstrated. In other words, it's of the part of the lesson book that God is giving the universe to see the effects of sin, and the insidiousness of sin, and what human beings and evil angels are capable of doing, even with something as beautiful as the message of the gospel. And this is not something that could have been seen in a century or two. It needed time to develop. So we don't actually need this concept that last generation theology proponents have introduced, that there's supposed to be some sort of final generation victory to explain the delay. We already have an explanation for the delay. We know that history needed to continue. The Bible tells us that there had to be a falling away first, and that the man of sin had to be revealed. And we were told that it's going to last over 1,000 and some years. And all this stuff has already been predicted as part of the process that God was going to allow to happen in order to make his case against sin. So we don't need to introduce this other element that last generation theology proponents are pushing, which is that um, you know some final generation has to accomplish some massive victory, or else God cannot win the great controversy. The questions that the great controversy has to answer are: what is the character of God? What is the character of Satan? What is the character of sin? We've had thousands of years to see these questions addressed. And the climax for the first two questions, what is the character of God and what is the character of Satan? The climax happened at the cross. The cross demonstrated who God really is and who Satan really is. But when it comes to sin, there was still more to understand. There was still more to demonstrate. And a lot of that was seen in the 2,000 years after Jesus came and gave his life for us. During this last 2,000 years, the universe had a chance to see the power of sin in a way that would not have been understood before the time of the cross, because humanity essentially didn't have the knowledge of God, so they were just blindly doing their thing. While now they had access to this knowledge, but they chose to take advantage of it in order to oppress people, in order to uh, even bring in more evil than before. So taking something good and turning it into something used for evil. It proved the insidious nature of sin to allow history to continue. So that is why we're still here. That is an explanation for this last 2,000 years, and we don't need to depend on the LGT solution. Now, sometimes last generation theology proponents will say, well, um, the reason it took this long is because people didn't have sufficient light. Because you could ask the question, well, if God needed a final generation to gain full victory over sin, why didn't he do that with some generation 1,000 years ago? And LGT proponents will say, well, the reason he couldn't do it is because they didn't have sufficient light. God needed to give people time to come into a fuller knowledge of God and full knowledge of the truth, so that now they could actually gain that victory and become perfect. Because if you don't know, for example, that the Sabbath should be kept, or that drinking alcohol is bad, those are the examples that LGTers always use. If you don't know those are wrong, then you don't know you're not supposed to do them, so you keep committing sin even though you're not aware of it. So first, you have to become fully aware of what is sin before you can become perfect. That's the LGT reasoning. But that's not a good excuse, because people had this light at the beginning of the Christian era. The apostles, they knew that the Sabbath was God's holy day, and they knew whatever it is they were supposed to be doing, that was the truth. We don't have more knowledge than they did. Um, the apostles had the knowledge, but then there was a falling away, and there was a losing of the light, and that the light that people lost over the centuries was recovered after the Reformation, and now we're in a sense coming back to a fuller knowledge of the truth. So this is just not a good explanation. Their explanation is not a good explanation for why things took this long, because if the only thing God needed was this last generation to gain full victory over sin, he could have done it early on in history and got rid of this falling away piece. There would have been a need to have a whole falling away into the dark ages. He could have just taken the apostles where they were, given them whatever additional light they needed to have a full understanding of the truth, produce this final generation, sometime in the 1st century or 2nd century, and be done with it, if that's the thing that God needed to finish the great controversy. So the LGT explanation doesn't work on many different levels. It doesn't make sense. It's even as the thing it's trying to explain, besides all these other problems that it has, that are in fact heretical in nature, because it's bringing out this idea that some human beings are joining forces, are tag teaming with Jesus to save humanity, which is just a vile concept if anybody knows anything about scripture. All right, so what am I saying with all this? What I'm saying is that I think it is time that we tried a different approach to dealing with last generation theology. So if we look at everything that has been written so far, all the books that people have published against last generation theology, all the different approaches that have been used for the past 60 years, they don't seem to get through to people. People are aware of them, and yet last generation theology is still a massive influence within our churches. So what I'm proposing is, let's triage the different versions of LGT and just focus on the one that's the most problematic, which is this idea of vindication, which has many different problems, like I've just explained. And I think if we came together as a church and we did a really good job at presenting this idea, focusing strictly on it and presenting it in its full, with all the issues that it has, so people really understand why it doesn't work. This idea is just bad. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. It creates so many problems theologically. I think we could actually get through to people better than in trying to convince them of all the other things that people have been writing about, trying to convince each other that this is right and this is wrong. If we focus on just this one element. So prioritize this LGT1, like I called it, which is the vindication motif. If we do a good job presenting all the problems with this idea, like I've just described, I think the majority of sensible people in our church will realize that this thing doesn't work, that it's a bad concept, it's a bad construct, and it's just not biblical. It's just not sensible to buy into this idea. And then we have to show them that look, this concept, once we demonstrate to people that this idea is bad, we have to show them that it is an idea that is held by key representatives of Last Generation Theology, people they respect, like Preby and many others throughout the past 60 years, that hold this idea. And others, even others that are silent on it, that don't talk about it hardly at all, um, they're most likely silent on it because they're embarrassed. In other words, they see that there's problems with the idea, but they still believe it. So even those who don't speak much about it, I put here that they're closet LGT1 proponents, because they're not open about the fact that they actually do believe and agree with Preby and all the others. And even if they don't agree with this, if there's anybody within this group of LGBT thought leaders who do not agree with this concept of vindication, they're still liable for it because, like I said in previous videos, they're part of this community of LGBT thought leaders. They do the symposiums, they get on stage with Preby, they get on stage with others that were pushing this, like this guy named Gomez, I don't remember his first name, and they give them the respect. So they're in a sense agreeing with this whether they want to or not. Just like I gave an example with Adam the other day that if a group of us got together and formed a ministry and we all preached on different things, but one of us preached against the Trinity, unless we address it, we're all liable for it because we're all part of the same ministry. So in a sense, even the people within LGBT circles that are not pushing the vindication aspect, the LGT1 version of LGT, if they're going to be part of this group, they're going to be they need to be held accountable along with everybody else who is pushing this. So we need to let people know that first, this idea is bad, that this group of people are actually supporting this idea, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And then we need to trace and show that this goes back all the way to Andreasen. And then people, hopefully those who are most sensible, will realize that something is wrong here. Like this thing doesn't work, this construct doesn't work. And understand that there were problems going all the way back to the beginning of this division in Adventist history. And it's not just Froome's fault. It's not just QOD or the evangelicals and everybody else, the way that their narrative has been, because a lot of these people have been educated by Last Generation Theology proponents to think that all the problems were on the left side of the issue. So Froome went off and he was trying to court the evangelicals. He was trying to change Adventism to make it more palatable to people outside the church. And the GC was on his side because they had apostatized. But if we can zero in on this idea and demonstrate that the idea is bad, this vindication motif is bad, and it is part of the whole LGBT culture all the way back to Andreasen, the people will start to recognize that mistakes were made on their side of the issue as well. And I think there's a chance that we can develop, finally, after 60 years, we can develop a consensus, and we can finally have something for these two sides of Adventism to reunite on and recognize that the vindication motif is problematic. And if we could do that, then maybe that'll be a first step towards healing this division that has been part of our church for so long. So that's what I'm proposing. That's the strategy that I'm trying to put out there. That's why I'm doing this. That's why I'm involved in these conversations, because I think maybe this can be a way to bring about healing in the Adventist church for something that has split the church for an incredibly long period.